Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Hector Castillo, Chief Product Officer at Byond, and I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion. And today we're going to be focusing on this particular topic, steps to boost your business resilience. And our guest panelists and speakers today are Tom Stevens and also Laurie Wiggins. Tom, how are you doing today?
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you.
All right. And Laurie, how are you doing?
Doing well. Great to be here, Hector.
All right. And audience, welcome. Before we get started, I want to focus on this particular general housekeeping items. Number one, you are in listen-only mode and can hear us, see us, but you won't be able to talk to us. So the best way to engage with us is to actually use the chat window or the Q&A window and then submit your questions or comments. We'll be monitoring your comments and make sure that we can interrupt the speakers as questions come in. And the earlier you submit the questions, the better we can actually try to fit them in before we end our program. If you encounter any audio issues during the session, please refresh your browser and make sure you check your audio settings as well. And once again, you can submit your questions at any time. We will have a Q&A portion before the end of today's discussion. But the earlier you submit your questions, then we'll be sure to interrupt the panelists, make sure that we can submit your questions if they're related to the topic of discussion. Also, we're recording today's entire session, and you will receive a link where you can view the content from today's discussion a few days after today's session. So that's pretty much what we're doing. Also, a special shout out and thanks to Scott Taylor, who is our video producer, and he's making sure that afterwards we will be packaging the video session so that you can actually will have availability to the video playback. And also, before we get started, I actually would like to formally introduce the panelists and allow them to introduce themselves. And you already I've already gave a brief introduction. I'll be serving as moderator today. And I would like to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. So why don't we start with you, Laurie? Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Hector. Hi, everyone. I'm Laurie Wiggins. I'm the CEO of Byond. Byond assists mid-market technology and software companies to scale, buy, and sell. Tom? Welcome,
Great.
by the way.
Tom,
Yeah,
welcome.
hi.
Also, can you introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. My name again is Tom Stevens. I'm the managing director of Prescient360 Group, a small professional services firm located in Northern Virginia. I'm an economist by training who saw the light and got out of being an economist. I've been working with companies of all sizes, organizations of all sizes for more than 15 years.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to have you both here. And today's agenda, just so that you know, we are going to be talking about business resilience. We're going to talk about what is it, why should you even be concerned about it, and how do you actually start building that within your organization. And we're going to talk about and introduce to you a resilience framework that can be used by organizations to actually start assessing your current level of resilience and figure out how to build it in the right directions. And we're going to talk about everything that entails resilience within a business, any business. And that's what both Tom and Laurie will be discussing today. Then we're going to talk about some next steps. And before we close, we are going to have a formal Q&A portion. So feel free to type in your questions, use the chat window or the Q&A portion to submit your questions, and we can get started. So to get us started, I'd like to ask Laurie to take it away with the very first topic on the agenda, which is resilience.
Thank you, Hector. Why are we talking about resilience today? First, there's renewed attention on the subject because of COVID-19, but also because of the ever-increasing change of pace in many areas, including technology, markets, regulations, and we'll learn more about that in a moment. Also, it's of increasing importance because of these other changes for companies that want to scale successfully, that want to sell at their maximum value, or that want to acquire successfully. when you talk to people about what resilience is, they all nod their heads and say it's a good thing, but they seem to have different ideas about what it is. So we are providing this information to sort of level set the conversation. So it's really about an organization's ability to rapidly adapt in the face of business disruptions while you safeguard your employees and your assets, and you're preserving your core values while you are continuously operating your core business functions. And you don't have to have a pandemic to have renewed focus on resilience. It can be conditions that have slowly worsened through time so that now they are negatively impacting your business. For example, the ever increasing number of storms and natural disasters we seem to be experiencing that have dramatically increased over the last 10 years.
Laurie, let me just mention one thing about the slow business
Yes.
disruptions. Sometimes those are the most difficult to see. I think we need to keep in mind that I always use the example of Blockbuster. How many of us used to go to video stores a long time ago? And 15 years ago, Blockbuster had 9,000 stores 15 years ago. 2019, they had 2, and 2020, they had 0. So that was a slow-moving disruption because they were completely missing what was happening in the marketplace and changing technology. So sometimes it's not the COVID, it's not the disaster, the fire in California. It may be something that moves very slow, sort of turtle-like, that we need to be also putting on our radar screens.
Great point, Tom. Thanks. And speaking of which, it's not just the ability to withstand unexpected shocks and keep going in some form or fashion. It's about the speed and competency with which your company responds, as well as the ability to maintain and even increase your revenues and profitability. It's not just, it's taking a licking and keep on ticking, according to the old commercial, but it's ticking in such a way that you keep growing. So resilience improvement often goes hand in hand with process improvement. It is often the result of process improvement. And there are many ways to improve your processes. There's a number of well-known frameworks such as Lean, Six Sigma, there's DMAIC, there's ISO, there's ITIL, there's CMMI. Some of these are applicable across all industries, some of them a handful of industries, but there's a number of ways that you can improve your processes. However, they all have some things in common, including ensuring that there's a common understanding of your process, that it is practiced consistently, and that it is documented, typically electronically. In order to have faster process change response, there is automation. And this enables a more rapid adjustment of your processes in response to changing conditions, as well as enabling the practitioners of those processes to gain competency on the new process rapidly.
Let me just add one point there.
Yes.
In my view, we apart from what Laurie just said, we need to think that resiliency is an outcome that we're seeking based on whether you use the different processes. But so resiliency in that sense is a function of a lot of things, including processes, procedures, and even the bureaucratic structures which a company creates to respond and act and do whatever it's doing, go from A to B. So in order to have a combination of bureaucratic structures, processes, procedures, systems in place, that's what leads to the kinds of resiliency outcome that a company wants or an organization wants. It's not simply thinking, oh, well, let's check the box and do a little bit of resilience. No, that's an outcome. So keep that in mind as you consider your own company's resiliency structure and status.
Absolutely. So the question does come up, how much resilience is enough resilience? And resilience is not binary. It's not you are resilient or you're not. It's a range. And resiliency is determined by assessing your business functions across your company. And you can anticipate pretty reliably that your resilience will vary between your business functions. You also couple that with your risk tolerance across various business functions. For example, a bank is going to have very low risk tolerance with respect to financial transactions of its customers. A manufacturing company is going to have very low risk tolerance with respect to its manufacturing processes, any variation in that. So with respect to the manufacturing company, beyond your normal controls, it probably has a higher risk tolerance for its financial transactions, for example. So you can see that resilience can get quite involved because resilience looks different depending on which function of the company you're talking about. So all this is to say that you really need some sort of comprehensive yet readily usable framework in order to assess and then build your resilience. So now that we've talked about what resilience is and that it is a good thing and we should pursue it, why should you spend time and money getting after resilience? What value is it to you? I have here a graph from a well-known Bain study, Bain and Company study, that looked at the performance of almost 3,900 companies from 2003 to 2017. All of these companies between 03 and 07 had double-digit growth year over year. In other words, their CAGRs, or common annual growth rate, was in the double digits. But when the Great Recession hit, there was a sharp divergence in performance. Those that continued to have strong CAGRs were dubbed winners by Bain versus everybody else. And the reason that the winners had such strong performance was that they managed their costs, and not to survive, but in order to fund their next stage of growth. They divested core assets to invest in, and they took that money to invest in the core business. As the recession eased, they were acquiring their competition who was ailing, and they were able to pick up bargains there. They kept investing in R&D. They focused on their top customers and maximizing their value to them. They retained their market spend. So they did things to continue to boost their value. And they exhibited high resilience by doing these things. So you can see through the recession that they actually achieved a 17% CAGR, and their outstanding CAGR continued through 2017. So by being more resilient, you have additional value. In fact, these companies actually achieved $6 billion in additional enterprise value. Let's look at this resilience framework that I just referred to. First, we have the big picture, which is the business ecosystem. And this is all of the external factors that impact your company. The core management functions include leadership and core values. And the operational functions include your business operations, back office, if you will, the customer facing and financial operations, functions rather. So Tom will be discussing the business ecosystem and leadership. Then I'll discuss the core functions and he'll finish up with the core values. So Tom, I'll turn the presentation over to you to talk about the business ecosystem.
Thanks, Laurie. Before we get to the business ecosystem specifically, in terms of the framework, we want to stress that that's simply a generic framework. It's not meant to be the answer. It's not the Bible of resilience frameworks. It's simply a way of thinking about it. Yours may look completely different, or how you view your company may be quite different, but the point is, at least it's a way of getting us thinking along the same subject. So I'm sure your framework would have something similar to this, even if the circles in the Venn diagram isn't exactly right. So keep that in mind as we sort of go through all of these. So we're not trying to promote any one answer to any one of these circles, but we're just trying to give a framework again for thinking about it. So as far as the ecosystem, here, the next slide there, you're familiar with what your business ecosystem is going to be. So, all of these that you've seen on this list are probably very familiar to you: the market, competitors, laws and regulations. Any one of those could affect how you do business. And therefore, how you respond to them and identify them is really the key to understanding these external factors. Let me mention black swan disruption. So that's a fairly common term, but usually a black swan disruptions are something that are not expected or anticipated. The probability is generally quite low, but the impact could be quite high. Now, we're living through a black swan event with COVID. So that's certainly an example, but there could be many. We could have environmental disruptions. Laurie mentioned something about the kinds of fires and disasters we could have. So that's part of, could be a black swan event. Socioeconomic or even financial, again, could be other kinds of black swan events that could affect us. In thinking about the business environment, I guess the point would be, for you as your company, you need to understand what your list is in terms of your business ecosystems. And we put together just a couple of questions which might help you think about how do you identify and prioritize those, and essentially what do you do in terms of being able to demonstrate that you can respond. Especially from an M&A perspective, it's how have you done in the past when you faced threats and shocks, and then how are you doing now in order to address them. I saw one example of a company that went back during an M&A process, went back to 2009 and wanted to know what the company had done. So the history could go back quite far in terms of understanding how a company can respond. So your reaction to the business ecosystem and identifying and being able to show how you prioritize those vulnerabilities and threats and shocks is exactly what is required essentially for the kinds of things where M&A issues are involved. Let me move on to leadership functions. These are not rocket science here, these examples of any C-suite group of professionals, executives will be looking at these similar sorts of things in some fashion or another. These are just our way of mentioning 5 of them. So there's, again, nothing special. Yours could be very different, but essentially most leadership functions will entail some combination of this and probably some others that you have that you deal with in your own case. again, two questions that I wanted to bring up on the next slide, which is, and I'm not going to ask you to answer this, but again, how would you demonstrate that you're responding to these? And what are the indicators to use that you have successfully responded? But there's two things that I want to stress here about the leadership. One is that in my experience, resilient companies are problem-solving companies, regardless of whether they're facing a threat or an external shock or even an internal shock. There is something that those companies which encourage problem-solving and joint decision-making, and essentially looking at multiple ways to redefine the business constantly, not necessarily where they're always under a threat or shock or worried about competitors, but constantly doing that. So a resilient company usually has that in place before even the shock comes, so that when the shock does come, it's better prepared to be able to pivot and do things in new ways. So resilient companies are usually very good about identifying and solving problems. And again, that could be whether it's a technology issue, whether it's a human resource issue, but they're good at that. Now, we all can see this happening as companies face the COVID crisis, and you look at how different companies or sectors have responded. The new normal, let me make this point too, the new normal that leadership has to decide is not this macroeconomic systemic new normal. It's essentially what is your new normal. So if you're in the technology field, that's going to be very different than if if you run a restaurant, or you're commercial real estate, or you're in car rental or event planning. All of those new normals are organization specific. They're not systemic issues. So we read a lot about the new normal, and that's very common when you read business reviews and business articles, but it's really your new normal. And another thing that I'd like to mention is that in terms of leadership, they say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I would also argue that there's something called institutional insanity, which is exactly the same thing, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So problem-solving companies, resilient companies, are those that essentially look for new ways of doing things, even if it can be minor, and it's usually decentralized problem-solving. Let me stop there. I talked too much. Laurie, back to you for the business operation functions.
It's all good. Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to talk about the core functions. And the first of these is business operations, or back office, non-customer facing operations, functions. These are things like HR, IT, new product development, office administration, and supply chain management. A good example of high resiliency is in the area of high cyber resiliency. And for savvy buyers, this is a key area of due diligence. A savvy buyer will dig deep to understand any past breaches, and especially for assets that they're particularly interested in, if there's been any degradation of value due to any past breaches. So using MITRE's handy-dandy definition of cyber resilience, it's basically the ability to anticipate, withstand, recover from, and adapt to adverse conditions, stresses, attacks, or compromises on your cyber resources. And if you have high cyber resilience, then you're doing things like you measure and know your assets and your infrastructure well. You perform the basics well. You're meticulous about your maintenance, including patches, updates, and access permissions. You're using some sort of a comprehensive approach to cyber resilience, cybersecurity, that is. For example, NIST's RMF, Risk Management Framework, you've implemented data-centric security, and you're using current technology that is appropriate for your infrastructure and your business needs. Let's look at customer-facing functions. And this is marketing, sales, brand management, customer service. So a high resilience stance in this area is one in which you're looking at not these separate teams or groups, but you're looking at things from the user and customer point of view. How do you optimize it, and how do you evolve it quickly when you need to? And not just during a pandemic, but when there are market and preference changes, evolving technologies. Changes would include ensuring that your marketing, sales, and customer service and new product development, all these teams are working together closely. They're well integrated so that they can respond quickly to your customers, to your users. You may have already introduced or will introduce automation to speed up that process, as well as facilitate internal coordination. And your result is a more resilient customer-facing organization. Financial functions include things like managing your cash flow and your revenue streams, modeling financial projections, and obtaining funding. And as Tom was talking about, you'll notice that through here we didn't try to list exhaustively functions in these areas, but examples, because they will vary company to company and industry to industry. Some good examples of high resiliency from a financial point of view is Stanley Black & Decker. Stanley was, during the last recession, was in a strong position. They'd made a number of acquisitions before the recession, and they were strong in their financial standing. They had been looking at Black & Decker for a number of years. As a matter of fact, the two companies had talked about merging, but the time never seemed right. Black & Decker during the recession had suffered a 22% drop in its revenues, as well as a 40% drop in its EBIT. Stanley bought them at that very nice discount, and they merged. They completed the deal in 2010 and have since had very healthy profits. Another great turnaround example is Airbnb. Airbnb had initially filed for their IPO this March, and then the pandemic hit and their revenues dropped precipitously. So they had fast-tracked an ability to feature rural getaways. People could jump in their car, go to a place in the country, and have a vacation. They didn't need to get on a plane. They didn't need to be around a lot of other people that they didn't live with. They could vacation and stay safe. And they attracted 100,000 new customers by featuring these staycation getaways. Airbnb also had some significant layoffs, and they had some budget cuts, but they have now sufficiently recovered so that at the end of August, they filed for another initial public offering. So now I'll turn it back over to Tom to talk about core values.
Thanks, Laurie. We're getting to our last circle here. when we were putting this little Venn diagram together, quite frankly, we didn't know where to put core values. We were thinking at one point that maybe that's a leadership function. But we decided to keep it separately because core values essentially emanate across the entire company. It's not just leadership deciding what it is, it's essentially people practicing it. So we've given some examples here of what might be some core values that companies could have. And again, your company could be very different. You could have a greater emphasis on X, Y, or Z and less on something else. But these are sort of common core values that most companies would strive to attain if they could in some fashion or another. Maybe they're limited, maybe they're not. But that's sort of a aspirational bar that companies like to have. But I've got two questions as usual. That's the way I do this about, what are your core values? But what I want to talk about is essentially, why are core values important for your company? And the answer is not because for some altruistic reason. Core values are inherent whether we're in a COVID crisis or not, essentially because core values reflect your brand. And to the extent that your brand shows that you care about some of these issues, then your brand and your reputation will be better than those who don't really put much emphasis on that. Now, this is perhaps, one end of the spectrum, it's an outlier. But if you look at the petroleum industry and you look at the way they have faced particular issues, whether it was the BP oil spill in the Gulf or Exxon Valdez in Alaska, they suffered terribly from essentially brand management problems because they looked like they were a company that really didn't care about the environment. They were taking shortcuts. At the other end of that, my company worked with Chevron, actually a business unit in Scotland many years ago, in which they had an oil spill. And essentially there was no public outcry because the company was firmly entrenched in the community. It was a caring business unit that wanted to take care of not just its employees, but essentially the community. And in fact, there were some people who came from outside who wanted to protest the oil spill, and it was the town that said, "Get out. We like Chevron. They're doing something that we like. They're cleaning up a mess. They admitted they made a mistake." And so they sort of demonstrated in this case that the other end of that spectrum for an oil company, which again is sort of maybe an outlier, but it suggests that brand management is essentially very closely tied to these core values. Another one is an example, which is more common, is when I think about, or what any of us think when we read the news about a poultry processing plant in Nebraska, which has nearly 200 cases of COVID. Now, I don't know anything about poultry processing other than I know it's a nasty business, and I don't want to be working in a poultry processing plant during my lifetime. But there's something to say that those companies did not care a whole lot about their employees. Apart from even terrible working conditions before COVID, what did they do when it happened? So that to me is a core value gone amok. So I'm sure there's a lot of reputational efforts to sort of, well, we got to fix this up, we got to improve our image, all of that, and all of public relations campaigns. But core values, and that's my point, is closely tied to your brand and your reputation. So don't downplay core values. That's just, you could talk about this in a lot of different ways, but let me stop with that point.
Thanks, Tom. So we have some resilience takeaways. First, resilience is especially important today because the business environment is ever more dynamic and unpredictable. Resilience is also a mindset. It's a willingness to proactively question the company status quo when conditions change. You don't wait for something to affect your company. You're going to go out and make the changes now so you can keep running forward. And although these are overused terms, they are appropriate here. A resilient organization is characterized by adaptability, agility, and flexibility. At this point, I'm going to ask the audience to please submit their questions in the chat window. And while you're doing that, we want to make an offer to you.
Well, thank you so much, Tom and Laurie, for this great discussion. We do have a couple of questions, and yeah, as I get into them, I want to make sure that at least we can talk about how we can help. So, Laurie, maybe you can actually discuss this a little bit further, how we can help as far as measuring. But one of the questions that came up is, it's how is it possible to manage business resilience when the organizations don't even know how to measure resilience? And I guess in the context of the framework that both you and Tom presented, what is the best approach to actually start measuring business resilience?
Tom?
Well, needless to say, there's no right or wrong answer, but every company uses some sort of metrics to measure performance. Now, the question then is, are those existing metrics appropriate for resilience? And I'm not trying to waffle here, but the answer is yes and no. Maybe it depends on what you're trying to see. I think what COVID has demonstrated is that potentially we need not just the old metrics we've been using, but we need to think about adding a few more. A clear example of this in terms of resilience is, how will we as a company react to changes in workplace and workforce? COVID has shown that, this is where I mentioned the commercial real estate industry is really suffering because it's going to be losing customers left and right. So I think the question is, what are those new metrics based on your new normal, which I mentioned, your new organizational normal, which need to be captured for us to essentially navigate in your organization's new normal, not that big systemic or macroeconomic new normal, but what are those which show that we're performing in those? So that might be essentially saying we need to rethink about, again, using workplace workforce. What employees do we need, and how can we retrain the ones we have? Is that an issue? How much office space do we need? Can we continue with this, Zoom world and GoToMeeting world more than we did? Well, we have to give up some of the trips to Las Vegas and the technology shows or wherever it is. Those are the sorts of things where I think some sorts of new metrics will be necessary in the face of something like COVID. Finally, they're the slow-moving shocks that we talked about, the example of Blockbuster. What would be a metric that Blockbuster have been thinking about, which would have not, so that they were not completely overwhelmed when something slowly creeped up on them, to essentially say, hey, we're really hurting. We've been outgunned by Netflix, which of course now we know what Netflix is, but it was essentially outmaneuvered something like Blockbuster and the whole business model. So there's maybe even business model metrics that we can think about too when we talk about resilience. Let me stop. I've said too much. Let me stop. Laurie.
So
This is great. So Laurie, go ahead and take, I don't know if you have anything to add, Laurie, but
I do. So I think that for the business functions, that there are very definitive metrics that you can use. Like, for example, with the cybersecurity example that I had, it's number of penetrations or number of breaches, right? For customer service or for user or customer facing functions, it's how fast do you solve their problem? So it's dependent on the function, the business function that you're talking about. But I do believe that there are metrics that you can employ across the board to help you measure resilience. There are a number of subjective measures and questions you can ask in order to measure your resilience improvement also. While everyone is posting their questions, I did want to make one offer to you, and that is, if you want to start your path today to greater resilience, we offer to have a 30-minute phone call with you to help you get clarity on where you're at with your business and resilience and how it can be improved. First, we assess the current state of your resilience and then identify processes that can help you increase it. We have methodologies to do this. If you want to do so, please sign up with us at bit.ly/BeyondAPPT for a free appointment. And I believe that Hector is posting this URL in the chat window now.
Yes, it is posted now.
Thank you. Further, we will be presenting a resilience workshop this fall where you can learn more about how to make your company more resilient. If you're interested, please email us at solutions@beyondma.com. And with that, I'll turn the program back over to Hector for our audience questions.
Thank you so much, Laurie. And we do have a few other questions. And as we do so, can we move on to the next slide as well? The next question that we have from the audience is, what is the relationship between resilience, a company's resilience, and profitability? Do they go hand in hand, or are they like a kind of opposite to each other?
Well, I think that initially, when you're making changes to take a higher resilience stance, that there's going to be a temporary impact on your profitability because you're making additional investments in your business. But those initial investments pay great dividends in the long run, as the Bain and Company study showed, and as McKinsey and other studies have shown. So I think there's a temporary hit, but a great long-term gain.
Tom, do you have anything to add regarding that particular question?
Also, I think because COVID is on our mind so much, there are companies who've taken a huge hit. So let's not downplay that. So
right.
The question is not whether they took the hit. The question is, how quickly did they respond? And rather than stick their head in the sand, simply say, what can we do to reinvent our business? And that is that's a metaphysical question that every company may have to face at some time or another, whether it's COVID or not. So it's really this backs to the question of response and agility to respond, even if the short-term damage of the impact, the low probability, high impact shock, is not something that you expected. It created terrible cash flow problems potentially, and yet it's how did you respond and adapt? And so profitability is what we all want. It's the question is, we might not always be in an environment where that's possible in the short term. If it's not possible over the long term, then obviously that company or any company is going to be in trouble. But let's not downplay the potential risk. And that many companies, of course, face that now. At the same, let me just also throw out, there's another side of resiliency. I think about something like all of the home exercise equipment. There was this huge demand in home exercise equipment. We already got locked down. So, we're all buying those bicycles that can do everything, whistle Dixie and, count to 10 for you. You have your live instructor. Now, so they had a tremendous upsurge in demand, but they're going to have a tremendous downturn in demand once we all sort of get back to normal. And I can go back to my gym like I'd like to go. I'm just not going. So resilience is not just the downturns. It can also be, how do you deal with the upturns and the upsurges and trying to level out, essentially the growth curve. That's what we want. So that was just another little quick point.
No, I think that's a great point. And just to follow up with that, Zoom's gyrations have been very public as they went from tens of millions of users to hundreds of millions of users virtually in weeks. And They had a couple of problems that were very public, but they responded very rapidly to those problems to solve them. They have increased their capacity enormously, many times over what it was pre-pandemic, over the last weeks and months. And I think they're going to face a similar, Tom, drop in demand once the pandemic is over. However, they'll still do well because remote work is not going away. If you look at the level of remote work pre and post pandemic, it will still be far greater. So I acknowledge your point about both the highs and the lows. How do you respond? That's the mark of a highly resilient company when they can respond rapidly and well.
Yes, thank you so much. Now, as we wait for additional questions, I think there may be a couple that are coming in right now, but I want to just begin by telling the audience more about Byond and also Prescient360. At Byond, we believe in making a massive positive impact within any organization. And we focus on helping executives and founders of mid-market companies get fast growth for your technology and software companies. And we also help you prepare, not only scale your business, but also prepare your business for either exiting or to continue to grow and scale through acquisition. And for more information, you can visit our website, and we will share with you our contact information also as well. And also, let me tell you a little more about Prescient360. This is Tom's company. Tom is managing partner within Prescient360 Group. It was founded in 2005, and they focus on helping organizations navigate more effectively in times of rapid change and shifting environments and ecosystems. Also, they specialize in helping executives and founders of companies and boards to actually focus on strategic planning, building and boosting organizational resilience, as well as focusing on change management on how to actually start building your business resilience and also manage risk accordingly. For more information about Prescient360, you can actually go to their website at www.prescient360.com. And then finally, you can also contact us, and this is the information where you can contact us. You can either contact us via email or connect with us via LinkedIn. These are the URLs to our LinkedIn profiles. And you can also feel free to just email us as well. And the next question, and I think we might have a question for this, maybe the last one. I will see how long it takes to actually answer this one. We talked about how to measure, but the question is, how does building resilience for my business, does it really help or hurt me in figuring out how to scale my business?
It helps you, and here's why. The things that you do to become more highly resilient have overlap with those things that you do to scale. And when you grow fast, you have to be more resilient, because in order to grow fast, you have to do everything faster. You have to be more responsive in your customer-facing functions. You have to have your back office functions respond more rapidly as more demands are made upon it. You have to respond faster in terms of your IT, your cybersecurity, and your financial functions. You have to move faster. And since high resilience involves that faster, more competent response, there's a lot of overlap between the things you do to be more highly resilient and what you do to scale.
Tom, do you have anything to add?
Let me add one thing. I said I wasn't going to talk about this, but I will. In preparing for this webinar, I went back and, as much as I hate to say this, I went back and looked at Michael Porter and competitive advantage. How many of us remember reading about competitive advantage in Michael Porter? And if 15 years ago or however many years ago Michael Porter wrote that book, and we're talking about competitive advantage, now suddenly we're talking about resilience. In some ways, it's essentially, how do you look at the elephant? And so resilience might be one definition, that might be looking at the ear, but ultimately and competitive advantage is another part of the elephant. But the point is that it's essentially it's how is the company able to respond and grow and change? And if it doesn't respond and grow and change, then it's not going to stay in business very long. So in that sense, resilience is part of a pie, a much larger pie that includes multiple factors, from the dynamics of the leadership team to the loyalty of the employees to all series of things. But resilience in some ways is sort of a barometer of a lot of that. So it's not the answer. It's only really, in some ways, again, I'd say the barometer or reflection of what a company ought to be doing all the time anyway. So what you'd like to capture is, well, are we resilient because we're doing all those things that are captured by this barometer scale? And the answer is hopefully yes. If not, then what do we need to do to make it more, responsive to where we want to go? And as, Laurie and Hector have been saying, how do you scale and how do you grow successfully?
Mm-hmm. I just want to add that right now, one of the things that has been happening, and this is part of the reasons why there's so much adoption with Zoom and other things that have been sort of like now all of a sudden getting quick adoption, is that most organizations today, I think it was Laurie earlier saying that the essential part of anyone who's a resilience leader is to focus on not just growing the top line revenue, sales revenue, but also constantly looking for new ways to reduce costs without losing the value that you're delivering in the market to your customers, right? Still manage the customer experience, be best in class in consistently delivering the right experience that your customers expect, but still focus on cost reduction, constantly doing that. And a lot of that is basically, you think about, what are the ways to cost reduce and still be able to do more with the same people, and do more with less time needed from your workers, so that now you can have a deep bench, so to speak. Even your team remains the same size based on the number of people, but now you can shift them to different things that you need to pay attention based on what's changing within your business or your market. But that is automation, right? Automation is what is key. And once you start recognizing that you have certain critical business functions that are being constantly stressed or constantly being compressed because of these changes that happen that are hard to predict, that you can now start looking at that range of stretching and compression that happen across those business functions. And you want to start automating to start recognizing, are we, is compression rising? Is stretching rising? And if so, at least try to not only predict what's happening, but then be more prescriptive in your actions, which means if you already know that it's a bad outcome, that if you allow, the stretching or compression to go beyond a certain threshold, that you now start in anticipation of that, start shifting your focus on making sure that you're redirecting your people and your processes to start making sure that everything stays within control and still not lose that value proposition that you're delivering. And it's almost like you have to have clarity as to what are these core business functions that are part of any of those circles that you showed in your framework earlier, because there are multiple, not just one, multiple business functions that are constantly being either stretched or compressed in different directions within those. And it's the adaptability, flexibility is really about allocating people to be on the right places, so to speak, and maybe even, focus on different business functions that are being stressed or compressed, and being able to make sure that you stay still within the actionable, where you still are able to conduct business and maintain your value proposition. And that is what becomes your competitive advantage. Tying it back to what you focused on, Tom, that competitive advantage is dynamic. And now you're focusing your team on saying, what are the critical business functions that we must maintain no matter what, in order for us to remain, that even as the market is dynamic, that we still maintain our competitive advantage. So
Yes.
that's kind of like a closing. And I wasn't really sure. Do you have any closing thoughts, Tom or Laurie? Tom, you go first if you have any closing thoughts.
No, it's been fun. Again, I'm sort of passionate about this subject, so, and I think we're all grappling with what this means for our individual organizations and companies. And one final point is, resilience is not simply something that the private sector is concerned with. One of our clients is a public company. It's a private voluntary organization that's facing exactly the same thing. Charities are facing this, so it's not something just limited to the the private sector, and it's affecting us across government, private sector, public sector, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever function that you provide, whatever function, services, products that your company provides, whether it's public, it's private, it's government, it's nonprofit, it's for-profit, resilience will help you deliver it better. High resilience will help you deliver it better. That's
Sounds
it.
great. Well, I want to thank both of you so much, and to also thank the audience for joining us. And Laurie, Tom, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to see you again and continue this discussion maybe at some point in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hector. Take care, everybody.